Um, and Jack said that, sure, why don't you talk about where you are coming from in this process, in this conflict, and maybe we can take it from there. So I wrote something, just some few points, and sent it to Jack, and then Jack started to kind of develop it in his own voice, and through probably maybe less than a half a dozen exchange of emails. Not even that, probably, right? We were able to finish the product in less than a day. But the lesson there is that we could not have done this had we not known each other before. So even if I made a point that Jack disagreed with, or he made a point that I disagreed with, I knew where he was coming from, and he knew where I was coming from. And we shared a mutual respect for each other. And we shared a mutual respect for each other's views. And we shared a common goal. So I think those are kind of the lessons that we can probably share with you as you and a brilliantly diverse group of people. And how you interact with each other, coming from your different perspectives. If you want to solve common problems together, and you will inherit these problems, because I'm not sure that we will see a resolution to this conflict in our lifetime. I hold out hope, but I'm not very optimistic about it. So you will inherit some of these problems. And the only way you can solve them is if you have built relationship and friendships during normal times, and you respect each other even when you disagree with them.
I think it's important to add in here that in the course of the past 6 years, our families have started to get to know each other. That, you know, Audrey and I own a little beach getaway place down in Ponte Vedra Beach, South Ponte Vedra Beach. So it became easy then we come over to have Parvez and Savannah come to our place. They had us for dinner, that's where I met Tara. Parvez and Savannah had us for dinner at their house, and that's where we first met Inam and Hisham, their children. Inam is now a freshman at Florida State University, and I look forward to hosting her at my house, you know, after she gets a chance to settle in and get used to being in college. Then, you know, then we'll bother her a little bit. But so it's not just meeting each other at formal events, but it's forming a friendship. I mean, we really care about what goes on in each other's lives. And when Parvez is in Tallahassee just a couple weeks ago when they dropped Inam off, and we all went for dinner, and it's not just the formal times; it's mostly just the informal times. So when Parvez sent me the email, don't you think we should write something? It was absolutely. And my only critique of his first draft of what he sent to me, and what we did is we each exchanged some talking points. And his talking points were a little different from my talking points. And those talking points come from, again, our natural communal affinities. But then Parvez went ahead and drafted a very rough draft of a piece, and my critique of it had nothing to do with any particular point that he made. I felt that the piece would be more powerful if, instead of skewing towards political analysis, which of course you have to do a little bit of political analysis, that it had to begin from a place that we are a Jew and a Muslim who are friends, and that the conflict is a conflict that is causing both of us deep sorrow. And it's causing us deep sorrow because people are suffering, and that it didn't matter if the suffering was occurring in Israel or in Gaza. That if people are suffering, we're both sad. And so when we were able to start from that point, my critique was simply, let's start from the basis of our friendship and then build it from there. So his email response was very short: okay, do a draft. All right. So all right, you're gonna be a wise guy, then go ahead and do it. So I then took Parvez's material that he wrote. I kept one paragraph without change. I thought the way he closed was just a beautiful, powerful way to close, and he used the text from Torah that I thought was very appropriate. So, and I liked the way he used it. So it was a perfect closing paragraph. And then I formulated the rest of it based on my thought that it had to come from a place of our friendship and our mutual concerns and sorrows. and then built the piece, and I sent it to him. I said, okay, what do you think? And his response was, I have one small edit. And it was like a minor punctuation type of thing. And so we had it. Now, how did we get to something that we both could sign off on so easily? It's because of the relationship that's been formed. So if we have anything to teach anybody, it's that you shouting at each other from mountaintops doesn't really do very much, but getting to know people and breaking bread with them and becoming friends with them, all of a sudden the differences just don't seem as important anymore, and you look for ways to say, how can we get around this, and how can we actually come together, and how can we better understand each other?
So one more thing that I can add to this conversation is that whenever you are facing a conflict situation, where there are two sides to a conflict and people have definitive perspectives, passionately held perspectives on each side, it does no good to get things off your chest. If you're having a conversation, if you're trying to say something, just to get something off, it does absolutely no good at that time. That's not the time to do it. There will be a time and a place perhaps to do that, but that's not the time to do it. So at that time, you want to say something that is meaningful. And it is meaningful not just to you, but also to the other side that you're having a conversation. And through that making of meaning, you will begin to find that there is a common ground somewhere. As Jack said, that both of us were horrified that people were suffering. People in Israel were terrified of rockets coming in, and people in Gaza were dying because bombs were falling on their heads. And so it is not a happy situation for anybody. So at the core, we agree that that has to stop. Both sides have to stop. So I think what Jack was alluding to, how I ended the piece, was actually by quoting Gandhi, that an eye for an eye makes the whole eye go blind, whole world go blind. And that's the essence of what I see as the conflict in the Middle East. It's always an eye for an eye. It is about who has the last word. Who can inflict the most damage, who can inflict the most terror. And it's not helping. For 70 years, people don't have a resolution to the conflict. And they will never have a resolution until they begin to see the suffering and the humanity of the other side. There is a different perspective at the table. And we have to engage with that perspective and understand what the perspective is coming from. If people in Israel are fearful, people on the Muslim side, on the Arab side, cannot be dismissive of that. And if people in Gaza are living in an open prison, then Jews cannot be dismissive of that. Those are realities. So we have to acknowledge those realities, work off those realities, and then begin to say, where is the common ground? How can we solve the conflict?
So it's interesting, the name of this program is called Difficult Conversations. So the irony is that none of my conversations with Parvez have been difficult. My most difficult conversations have been within my own community. Okay? Now, I have to qualify that statement by saying this. Most of my congregation and most of the Jewish community of Tallahassee with which I interacted post the appearance of our editorial, and it appeared in the Huff Post, and it appeared in our paper here, it appeared in the Jacksonville paper. Most of the community was almost relieved and said things to me like, finally somebody is not just chest thumping, but you guys are trying to move this forward to a different place. That was the majority. But there were definitely some people who confronted me with, how can you try and draw any equivalence between Israel and Hamas? In fact, I did a whole interview on Shalom TV with somebody who's coming from a very what I would call right-wing perspective, who asked me that on this national TV thing. And my response was, I wasn't trying to draw a moral equivalence between anyone, but if, in our tradition, the fellow interviewing me was a rabbi, so I could talk in these terms to him, if Jewish tradition teaches that what we call in English sin is not just an evil intent, but if we accept that what we call sin is an action that went wrong, that has a bad consequence, even if we didn't intend the bad consequence, then we still have to take responsibility for the consequence. And does not our tradition teach that if you do something and somebody suffers because of it, even if you had no thought in mind that a bad result would be, you have to deal with the bad result and take some responsibility. You can't just walk away and go, sorry, I didn't mean to do bad. And so the maybe two people who listen to the broadcast, one of whom contacted me and said, "You made a great point. I was so glad you brought that up." But the more difficult conversations were never with Parvez, but with people from my own community who wanted me to chest thump instead of try to find a more common ground.
So and I had the same experience. So some of the pushback that I got was, again, very minority voice and very minuscule minority within my community that read the article and were upset that, and one of the responses was, "How could you write an article with a Jew during this period of time?" And I said, well, when else do I want to write an article? If I can't write something with somebody of a different faith during this time, then when do you want me to write it? And then I asked him, and he was ranting and raving in his email, and so I said, "What exactly do you find problematic in what I wrote? What exactly would you want to change?" And there was like radio silence. So he really was not upset about anything. He was just upset for being upset. So I think part of the problem is that when we are in a state of fear and in a state of extreme anxiety, then we become irrational. When even the most rational idea or the most rational discourse, we are trying to look for fault points and trying to latch on to those fault points to create more opportunities to vent. That's what I said. If your whole point is to vent during a difficult situation, you're not helping the situation. You're probably not even helping yourself. So instead of trying to find those fault points, try to look past some of them and see where are the common points. And obviously not every action that Israel takes, Jack agrees with, and not every position that Palestinians hold, I agree with. We can. Because there is because if they had some aspect, some thought about compromise, and I think we wrote this, I think this is what part of the Talmud or the Torah that I quoted in the article, which is that if you don't love your children more than you hate your enemies, then you can never find compromise and peace. You have to love your children more than you hate your enemies. And I think the moral of the conflict, or the story of the conflict about the Israelis and the Palestinians is that they have not yet learned to do that. They're still kind of trying to redress past grievances as opposed to look to the future and say, what will the future look like? Even if I lose on some minor point in making a compromise today, will my children actually have a better life than I have today? If they can focus on that question, I think they will get to a solution. Perhaps. We don't pretend that the solution is easy, but we think that because everything else has been tried and so far it has not worked. Maybe there's a different way to approach the conflict, and some things may come out of it.
Yeah, to just reiterate something that Parvez is talking about, put in a slightly different framework. I grew up, of course, in a household that very, very committed to Israel as a state. I've lived in Israel, but one of the things that I've learned is that if we're going to move forward, it can't be about proving the correctness of a narrative. Because I'm never going to convince somebody else of the correctness of the narrative that I believe. The only thing I can do is try to understand their narrative and try to see how can we find a way out of this? How can we move to a different place? And where people get stuck in difficult conversations is trying to prove the righteousness of their position or their narrative, instead of listening and perhaps getting a little bit of understanding of the other person's narrative and why they have that narrative and why they have accepted that narrative. Because what I find is that no singular narrative is either totally true or totally false. That there is truth in all the narratives, and we have to learn ways to make those truths fit together in a way that everybody can move can move forward. Nobody has a corner on the market of righteousness.
You want to open it up for questions?
You ready?
Yeah, really?
Okay.
All right, I'll ask you to be mindful of the safe space guidelines, and I
The nationalist group, you can also describe them as a ruling governing body. They fit all three descriptions. So when they were elected, Jack and I were having this conversation this afternoon, that people in Gaza elected Hamas not because they agreed with Hamas's ideology that they want to destroy Israel, but they elected Hamas because they were tired of Fatah, which is the opposing political party in Palestine. They were tired of their corruption. So they were looking for an alternative. And Hamas, which engages in social services, appeared to them as an alternative. And we were talking about this in the political context, if we may wear a little bit of the political hat. It was the US that encouraged Palestinians to hold an election. And I was telling Jack that the view in the US is that Hamas is a terrorist organization. Well, then they should have been excluded from running for a political position. And if we allowed them to run for the political office, then we have to accept the results of that outcome. So people in Gaza elected Hamas. And instead of engaging with them, and Israel included, cut off any form of conversation or cooperation. And since then, things have not helped. It has not helped the people of Gaza, and it has certainly not brought in more peace to a long-festering conflict. If you ask the people of Gaza today, and this is why I think Hamas started to fire those rockets, because today they're deeply unpopular, because they have not delivered. Partly it is their fault, partly it is the circumstance, because they have a blockade and there are other factors that have inhibited their ability to govern properly. But they're also not, they are very fundamentalist, they are very, their approach towards governance is based on ideology that is not inclusive of others. So there is a heavy injection of religion or theology into statecraft, which something personally I don't agree with. I do believe in the separation of church and state as a governing philosophy, particularly of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. And Palestinians are certainly multi-religious because a lot of Christians among Palestinians. And certainly Hamas does not believe in that. So today they're quite unpopular, or they were unpopular before the conflict, this latest round of conflict started. And also they were beginning to give up some of their exclusive control of Gaza because they were talking to the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority to come over and take over the governance of Gaza because they spectacularly failed in that. But to kind of show their muscle and keep their power alive, they thought the conflict would help them keep their power alive. And it actually may. So in fact, Israel's actions against Hamas may have actually strengthened Hamas. It has not weakened Hamas. Ultimately, the biggest price that was paid by the people of Gaza, not so much by the political and ideological forces of Hamas. And this is the tragedy, and this is why Jack and I were talking about that this nonsense has to stop. This conflict has to stop. Thank you.
Well, let me just ask, when you ask a question, and I didn't put this out there a minute ago, would you say your name and remind us of your worldview identity?
Okay, I'm Nathan, I'm a Christian.
Thank you. Who else has a question? Give us your name and your worldview. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mitchell. I was raised Jewish. Now I consider myself an atheist. My question is for the rabbi. Since the formation of Israel in 1947, the Jewish people have predominantly had conflicts with all the surrounding countries. Do you believe that it is possible for the Jewish people in Israel to ever not be conflicting with their neighbors?
It's a loaded question because it's a loaded question from on a few different levels. Number one, the way you worded it sounds like all of the conflict is because of the Jewish people. Number two is You are also saying that 1947 is the beginning of the conflict, and it is not. Actually, this is a conflict that has much longer, deeper historical roots. And if we're going to talk about just the current, meaning the modern state of Israel and surrounding Arab countries, you're talking about something that really has its beginnings in the 1890s, with the development of the modern movement to have a Jewish state in the area of Palestine. So, with all of that qualification put out there, do I think that there's any hope for there not to be conflict? I'm going to put on just a political hat for a second. If there are any rays of hope that come out of a really gloomy and awful summer, okay, I would say that within Israel, which has a free press, there are tremendous voices of dissent in terms of the current government that are trying to point out the possibility of a different way. Even in the government, Tzipi Livni is trying to form a different path. I read Israeli papers every morning, and it's funny. On Sunday morning, I was asked to give a presentation at a Presbyterian church to give the Israeli perspective on what went on. So my first qualification was, do you want me to give the perspective of the Netanyahu government, or do you want me to give you the perspective of the editorial page of Haaretz? Because they're completely different things. Okay, so I think the glimmer of hope is there is a serious conversation going on in Israel among key Israeli politicians. Not, unfortunately, Netanyahu, but other people that are in the government who are asking the question, did we make a mistake by discouraging the unity government just several months ago? Are there things we could have done to move this in a different direction? And what are some of the things we might be able to do to move this in a different direction? Now, what is a different direction? For the first time in a long time, there is a growing acceptance that the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas is going to be their partner. Okay? And the PA and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Israel have now some common ground on which to work. That's not, believe me, I'm not betting on, I'm not betting my life on this, but it provides me at least a tiny glimmer that there are some people out there that are trying to forge a different path and trying to think of this a little bit differently. The problems are monumental. The problems are monumental. On the Jewish side, we have to wrestle with the settlements, and we have to be willing to move settlements. There is just no way around that. We moved them out of Gaza in 2005, and we moved them out of the Sinai Peninsula in 1980-81 as a result of different peace treaties. I do not understand, and a lot of people like me do not understand, why there is this reluctance to grapple with this among certain aspects of the Israeli government. But there's no way around it. There's going to have to be a movement of population. That's a huge impediment. That's a huge difficulty, and I'm not smart enough to know how to solve that. Okay. On the other side of the equation, not the Israeli side, but on the Palestinian and the Muslim side, we have to acknowledge there is a history of anti-Judaism that runs very deep, and is not just about a political thing. There is a prejudice there that is difficult to grapple with and hard to overcome. Is it every Palestinian? Absolutely not. Okay. Is it every Muslim? Absolutely not. But there is something there that has to be acknowledged and grappled with, and so you have these impediments on both sides that make it difficult. But you know what? I'm a rabbi, and I'm really hopeful, and I'm the kind of person who thinks that ultimately you'll find people of goodwill, and you'll find people that understand that you have to choose life and not death, that you have to choose prosperity and not despair, and that ultimately it may not be in my lifetime, but someday, hopefully it'll happen. Hopefully it'll happen.
So just as a quick follow-up on that question, recently, just a few days ago, Israel announced that they were annexing about 1,000 acres of Palestinian land in Jerusalem. Obviously, that's not going to help the conflict.
Not at all.
So there has to be a recognition. Now, there is a formula that actually President Carter had proposed on how to resolve the settlement issue, which I think is a workable formula. He says that the settlements can stay as long as Israel trades up land from other places. So there's an equivalent trade-off of land, and I think it can work. But again, there are solutions out there. I think, and the solutions are imaginative. But there is not a political will to accept those solutions. Without a doubt, there is a virulent strain of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment within the Muslim communities, both in the U.S. as well as abroad. Small, but nonetheless present, and we have to be honest with ourselves. It is there. Sometimes people use obscure readings of sacred texts to justify those positions. But what I also noticed particularly during this conflict, I don't read the Israeli press as diligently as Jack reads it, but occasionally I do go to the Israeli, particularly to Haaretz to read it. And I saw many Jewish writers, Israeli writers, talking much more openly than ever before. The rising strain of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiments in Jewish public conversations. That was not present even a few years ago. It has suddenly this conflict had exasperated those things. But that's the nature of the conflict. At the root of it, so long as we have these conflicts festering, we will not be able to tap down onto the darker side of human existence. So we have to resolve the conflict. And both sides have to realize that there is no solution that will make everybody happy. And if there was that, everybody would have grasped onto that by now. So people will have to make difficult choices. And there is a tradition of Prophet Muhammad that talks about that. When he was entering into a treaty with his tribe that had forced him to leave Mecca, and he entered into what was called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, he accepted terms of the treaty that was very, very unfavorable to his side. And his companions were upset that why did he accept those terms of treaty that was unfavorable to his side. And he said that I want peace first. Having peace is more important than getting everything that you want. And I think if we can latch on to those aspirations and remember those high points in our own history, and I'm sure there are many such inspiring stories on the Jewish side. If we in our own communities can reinforce these conversations of positivity and self-sacrifice to achieve the ideals of peace, I think there is hope.
I'll give you a more modern glimmer, anecdotal thing that actually a friend of mine, it was occurred in 1996 while I was living in Israel for a year, and a friend of mine, his daughter had been our au pair when we lived in Philadelphia, and so when I was living in Israel, of course, I was with them a lot. And he, if anybody knows anything about Israeli politics, you understand what I'm saying, he was a voter for Likud, which is a right-wing party. But his job, and this is in 1996 when the Oslo Accords were underway and borders were more open and there was a lot going back and forth, and his name is Asher. And his job was to be he was a technical representative for a recycling company. All of his territory that he serviced and all of his customers were Palestinian, and all in the Palestinian areas. And he said to me, he didn't vote for Likud because he supported Likud in terms of its relationship between Israel and Palestine. He believed that it was economic policies, okay? But he said to me, this is a Likud supporter, said to me, I have fabulous relationships with my Palestinian customers. We talk all the time that we can't get along without each other. We need each other. We need each other economically. We need each other to prosper. And so there I see this glimmer of hope if there can be mutual prosperity, in which the talents of Israelis and the talents of Palestinians are actually fused together somewhere, the potential for a really amazing little area of the world is there if somehow it can be brought to be.
One more question, maybe two if we're short. I think you're
try
one,
to keep our
two,
answers
three.
short,
We'll,
yeah.
we'll do three. One,
Let's
two,
go rapid
three.
fire, we can take as many questions.
Your name and your
I'll use shorter
worldview.
sentences.
Yeah.
My name is John, and I'm a Christian. This is for any of you. The Prime Minister of Gaza threatened to break ties with the Hamas government, that his government would break ties with the Hamas community. Do you feel that Hamas might lose its political power? And if it feels like it's about to lose it, do you think that they will try to do anything they can to gain it back?
I don't follow the Israeli-Palestinian conflict closely, so I do not know the intricate details of what goes on. I know that Hamas wanted to forge a unity government, and both Israelis as well as the US and others blocked that, and it was unfortunate. I think if that process went through, I think, again, Hamas is not a palatable group to work with. Its ideology is not accepted, not just by Israelis and Americans. Many Muslims disagree with their ideology. But at the same time, it is the reality of what it is. Just like Likud's ideology is not agreed upon by every Jew. But it is the governing body in Israel, so you have to work with them to move towards a solution. So had the unity government gone through, that probably would have helped. And Hamas is actually on the issue of the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hamas is already a ceded ground to the Palestinian Authority. They will accept whatever agreement the Palestinian Authority reaches with Israel. Hamas has said they will abide by those. And Hamas has itself offered a truce, a long-term truce, that I think it should be the basis of some negotiation. Unless you reduce the tensions, we cannot ever get extremist groups to moderate. The more we have tension and chaos, the more the feed of that.
Yes.
My name is Hamza Ajmal. I'm Muslim. I have a question for both of y'all. So, do you guys know about the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement? And do you think it's effective?
No, I actually very much opposed to the boycott, divestment movement because it has implications and impacts in ways that the people who form the movement, and there are Jews involved in that movement, by the way, and I think that in the intention of trying to put an economic or political pressure on Israel, they miss some other points, and that is, just small example, in Great Britain, the Jewish community of Great Britain wished to do a Jewish film festival in a theater in London, and do you know about this?
Yeah, I read Haaretz a lot as well.
Huh?
I read Haaretz.
Okay, so because the Israeli government was going to grant a small bit of money to help fund the festival, and it wasn't an Israeli film festival, it was a Jewish film festival, the theater would not allow the festival to take place. Well, that's blaming all Jews for a particular policy in Israel. When you do a boycott of a company of doing business in Israel, it actually can sometimes negatively impact Palestinians. So I understand the intent behind it, and I know that the intent is not really a harmful intent. It's an attempt to apply a passive or nonviolent pressure, but for Jewish people it has implications and problems beyond the intent of what and the thing that happened in theaters is one tiny incident. I could sit here and give you incident after incident after incident that results from the BDS the BDS movement that I think that the people who are doing it probably don't intend, and what ends up happening is Jews are wondering, why are they hating me as a Jew when the Israeli government is doing X, and that becomes a problem. So thank you.
I'm Charles. I'm a secular humanist, and my question is more about Judaism, but specifically,